Life in a canoe is like life in combat. There are no gray areas like our normal everyday lives. No gray areas, black and white. The Marine Corps has a pretty good system. It works really well. Marines do not fight for God. They do not fight for country. They don't fight for their family. The only thing they fight for is the other Marines in their fire team, squad, and platoon. That's what you learn, and that's what you carry with you into that environment. So having the luxury of mulling over, I wonder what it's, how did I get here and what are the realities? Not for a moment. No, you only hope that you don't fail when it's incumbent upon you not to fail. As a young Marine, I was on a troop carrier. My first deployment was off the East Coast to the 7th Fleet in the Mediterranean. And we're on troop carriers. Those are beastly floating coffins, troop carriers. But that's how Marines were transported for years. And I went up on deck one night, clear, cold. I was by myself. I just got some fresh air. And I got hit with loneliness. Don't know where it came from. My knees buckled. I broke out in a sweat. I've never had anything quite like that. I've been really scared in my life, but I don't think I responded the way I did to that slug. It's the only way to describe it, of loneliness. I had an interesting job. That may sound peculiar, but I was trained as a radio operator. And so you go out and you could have ended up carrying it for a platoon commander, a company commander, battalion. It's just wherever they slotted you. I worked for a couple of guys who were scout observers, and then the scout observer was mortally wounded. So they gave me his map and compass and said, this is what you're going to call in the missions. I had no specialized training for that. You have to know a map and a compass better than you know your birth date. You have to always know where you are. Otherwise, you don't know where the enemy is. I was always at the point. They rotate platoons, they rotate squads and platoons, but the scout is always at the point. So at the end of my tour, they offered me officer's candidate school. I was so fucking scared I could barely keep from wetting myself when I'd get up in the morning, and I was afraid that I had a couple of weeks left in the field before I rotated back. It was all I could do to, not say, I'm not doing this anymore, screw you. But I didn't, and I went through, and I got recognized for my proficiency. I wasn't heroic, but I was proficient. When I got back from Vietnam, I met, by accident, another guy who was a scout like I was in Vietnam. And he was working a block from where I lived. We got together, closed the bars every night. I said, come on, and I always said I'd do an adventure if I got home. Have you done any adventures? No, I haven't done any adventures. So he sold his car. I sold my motorcycle. We bought a heavy aluminum canoe. We shipped it up north, and we lived in a place called Reindeer Lake for about 3 months. I came back to Chicago. He stayed up the whole winter. But that was 16 years before I was thinking about going back up by myself, and this trip was by myself. And I had been in a canoe before, so I think I'll do a canoe trip. You could eventually go from Montreal and exit the North American continent on the Yukon River at the Bering Strait. So that maze of waterways became known as the Fur Trade Route, or the Highway of the North. My intention was to travel as far as I could on that highway, that maze of rivers and streams. Then you say to yourself, well, I wonder who will go with me. Well, at the age of 40, there aren't a lot of people who are capable in any number of ways. They can't give up their life and spend 4 months in the bush, and they don't have the interest in being uncomfortable for 4 months. I did this trip in 1987. I'm 75 now. And it was an interesting phenomena as I look back on it. It was an unusual trip, very demanding, physically and mentally demanding. Much of my trip is upriver. And when I got home, even when my wife put my welcome home party together, I was quite embarrassed by it. I was embarrassed by the trip. I was embarrassed by having made the effort. I found it to be, as I say in my book, just so much of nothing. And it took me 20 years and time with a psychologist, before I could consider writing the story. It's always been a good how story. How does one person organize a voyage like this? And there's all the elements that you do. But it had never been the hows of the trip that impeded me from even talking about it very much. It was the whys of the trip. And when I started writing, every time I started writing, I realized I couldn't write the story unless I talked about the whys. It just didn't feel right. My time in Vietnam was very troubling for me, much more troubling than I had imagined. When I finally wrote those things down, their ability to cast a shadow on my life kind of went away. I mean, they're still there. It's my life. It's part of who I am. But eventually, I got a handle on that. I'm very thankful. And I enjoy my own company. I wasn't fighting being by myself in general. I loved the adventure of it, not knowing what was around the next bend. Solitude is a really big part of going that far by yourself. You have to distinguish between solitude and loneliness. I've been lonely. I wasn't on that trip.
Next week in West Loop, a guy scrambles to crack a crime wave.
And then there was a call for blood.
From Superphonic Studios, this is Chicago. Listen every Sunday.